Okay, so I'm on my lunch break at work. Got my computer here, so now I can record myself while I'm reading. So the issue I ran into yesterday, we got that figured out. So here we go. Why Marxism is Not Woke by Haz Al-Din. Proving beyond possible doubt that James Lindsay and other rightists are fundamentally wrong about Marxism and that Marxist theory in the West is meaningless without the aid of Dugin and Heidegger's thinking. Marxism has no reality at all in the West. Nearly all self-proclaimed Marxists are frauds who haven't even read Marx, let alone understand it. They use the label Marxism, despite knowing nothing about it, as a pseudo-intellectual obfuscation for their liberal ideology. Now, I'm not entirely sure about the second part. I agree with him, having already read this, and now I'm rereading it. I agree with him that Marxism has no reality at all in the West. That's true. But I'm willing to believe that a majority of people in the West who are nominally Marxist have read Marx, but I don't believe that they've read him in good faith. And I say that because, as I mentioned in my introduction, I had read cumulatively probably a few hundred pages of Marx, but I hadn't read it in good faith. And I came with the preconceived notions that nominal Marxists had given me about Marxism, and I read it through that lens. And so the essence of what he was saying escaped me because of that, because I wasn't reading it in good faith. And the reason I wasn't reading it in good faith is because I was handed an interpretation that was also not good faith. It has more to do with. He claims that it's Trotsky. I'm not as familiar with the Trotskyist school of thought, but I am familiar with the Frankfurt School of Thought, and I can tell you that uh, most Western Marxists are of the Frankfurt School, not of the classical Marxism-Leninism school. I will tell you that much. And I can tell you that firsthand as well because having met actual Marxist-Leninists in Russia who had been alive when Stalin was around, that's a very different sort of person from the person who considers themselves a Marxist in the US. Night and day difference. Not even a little bit similar. So, but I attribute that to Westerners being followers of the Frankfurt School instead of Marxism Leninism. So even if they're nominally Marxist Leninist, most of them are Frankfurt School adherents. Continuing on. To begin, what is Marxism? Marxism is not a theory of equality. It is not a diagnosis of injustice, nor is it a specific prescription of how to remedy society's ills. Marxism is a method for acquiring knowledge about the laws governing the historical development of societies. So, method of acquiring knowledge, that phrase right there, and we'll see further on, he states this explicitly, well, not explicitly in this sense, but he alludes to it more as you go on. That's very consistent with the pre-modern idea of what science is. Because in medieval philosophy before Descartes, so medieval and early modern philosophy prior to Descartes, scientia was not based on a particular methodology. There's a far more general understanding of science that just basically meant knowledge, And the sciences were considered to be branches of philosophy. So, for instance, natural science, uh, medical science, all these sciences, there really wasn't a clear distinction between them and philosophy. So they were branches of philosophy. There's Scientia, the pursuit of knowledge. Marxism thus regards itself as a type of science, right? Science in the medieval sense, the pre-modern sense. Most people think of science as something purely descriptive. That would be the modern understanding of science as being descriptive, the Cartesian understanding of science, which is based on Descartes' method. And Descartes' method involves breaking things into their component parts, into the simplest parts that you can, analyzing those simplest parts in terms of what can be measured, and then reconstructing the thing that's built on top of its component parts in order to have a scientific understanding, scientific in the modern understanding, a scientific understanding of the whole based on exact understanding, exact factual understanding of its component parts. As opposed to Scientia, which is something closer to what Heidegger would later uncover, and what I would say Hegel practiced. So Hegel didn't explicitly reject, so far as I know, Hegel didn't explicitly reject Descartes. He didn't even address Descartes, but he continued the medieval tradition of science as the pursuit of knowledge. So it's almost like parallel traditions in a sense. And then Heidegger comes along much later on and directly addresses the uh, the Cartesian tradition, which is highly dominant in the West today. But the reason Marx's contemporaries called him Prometheus is because he bequeathed a science that did not just describe reality, but participated in its development. And that's a very Heideggerian concept. So participating in the development of being is consistent with Heidegger's idea of Dasein as uh, as Haz will get into later on in this essay, which is being. Dasein is being. So um, he has this idea of, well, you're not these, because, okay, so Descartes had this fundamental idea of an individual being completely distinct, right? In fact, for Descartes, the subject is the fundamental thing, right? That the whole I think, therefore I am. He took a radically skeptic approach to understanding reality, and he found that the only thing he knew for sure was that he existed, because if he didn't exist, he wouldn't be able to think about whether or not he was existing. So, because of that, the subject now becomes the fundamental thing, not the not the object. So, to Heidegger, the subject and the object together comprise the fundamental irreducible thing. So, yes, you can break down Dasein into component parts, but when you do that, you lose sight of what being actually is, because being is not just the sum of its parts. It's something. It's something that results from the participation of those parts. So it's something a bit more esoteric than the different component parts. And when you break it down to the component parts, you lose sight of the essence of things. So you gain a lot of knowledge about the measure of things, but you lose sight of the meaning of things. And to him, that meaning was what was fundamental, not these facts that are related to different components of the thing. This makes Marxism totally contrary to modern science for the reasons I just explained. Modern science being Cartesian, and this understanding of Marxism being Hegelian and ultimately Heideggerian. And he'll walk us through that as well. Modern science places knowledge above its object. To know means to strip something naked to consciousness and turn it into a utility for the knowing subject. He who knows an object can control, master, and alter an object. This is what Heidegger's essay on the question concerning technology is about. So he's basically boiling down Heidegger's question of technology in a few sentences. That's a very useful read, that essay. It really brings Dasein into focus. So if you read that essay, you get a much better understanding of meaningfulness and being as Heidegger saw it. But again, modern science places knowledge above its object. So in other words, what modern science does, like I said, it breaks things down to component parts, analyzes the component parts, and it takes that knowledge about its component parts, those things that can be measured, it places that as having more significance than the meaning of the things that the components comprise. Right? So it loses sight of the forest for the trees. And doing that actually it gives you, like he says here, to know means to strip something naked to consciousness and turn it into a utility for the knowing subject. So in other words, when you understand something on that level, it gives you the ability to manipulate it in a technological way, as opposed to understanding and appreciating it for what it actually is. But the object known by Marxism is none other than human society itself. And the paradox lies in the obvious fact that society is not just an object, but also a subject. So here he's talking about it's not the subject that's irreducible, and it's not the object that's irreducible. It's the meaning that those two things create together that is what is irreducible. Marxist subjects are themselves part of the very object they make knowable. So that's the other thing. It's kind of like that experiment where they're trying to figure out if light was a particle or a wave, and just by observing it, it collapses from a wave into a particle. It's kind of like that. So when you try to measure society in an objective way, you are losing sight of the effect that you as a subject are having on the pursuit of understanding of that. To complicate matters further, Marx does not claim knowledge of society alone can transform society. Instead, he proves that society is already coming to know and transform itself materially in the form of the then growing proletarian class. So now he's alluding to the dialectical process, where you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That's some very basic Hegelian concepts, where basically you have things as they are, and then you have the contradiction within that. So at that time, you had the growing working class that was enabling the system to survive, but was creating miserable living conditions for them. And so then that caused conflict in the system. So you had a thesis and an antithesis, and you had conflict, and then you would have the synthesis, which would be progression towards communism. Right? Most people think Marx is Promethean because he wanted his ideas popularized. But the real reason was because he had the courage of declaring the return of knowledge back to being itself, and human beings in particular. He created a science that ceased to be above its object. So here he's talking. He's basically relating. He's relating Marx again to the Heideggerian concept of Dasein. For Marx, the knowledge of historical laws arrived at by consciousness was being reflected in history itself. So this is where he talks. This is where it's getting into Hegel. You need some help? Here, give me a second. All right, where were we? Yeah. For Marx, the knowledge of historical laws arrived at by consciousness was being reflected in history itself. Knowledge of humanity does not dominate humanity, but reveals that it was there and part of it all along. Communism is the riddle of history solved. So again, this is relating Hegel to Marx. I didn't get through it all, unfortunately, but I read a significant amount of Hegel's philosophy of history, and it talks about these. That's basically what the book is about, and it's about what drives the historical process. And of course, for Hegel, it was a spiritual process. For Marx, it's going to be more of a materialist process. Why the need for class consciousness? This is where people misunderstand Leninism as an attempt to turn politics and state power into a tool for realizing some goal of the mind. Mm-hmm. This is where people misunderstand as an attempt to turn politics and state power into a tool for realizing some goal of the mind. In reality, the role of Marxists lies in spreading the good news to the despairing proletariat. I don't remember that part. That's interesting. That's really good. That's really good. It's like it's a gospel, right? So it's getting the people to participate in politics to bring about their interests, right? And it seems to me like there does have to be some of this attempt to use state power to realize concrete goals of leadership. But then the balance is to really try to get a picture of the outcome that would be in the best interests and reflecting the desires of the people, right? It's interesting to think about. Class consciousness, the so-called vanguard party, and the communist state is the realization of the proletariat's faith in itself. Communism is not realized automatically without the participation of a communist party, because society is not just an object. Neither just a subject either. Communist parties do not create new societies, only guide the existing development of society. This guidance is necessary because politics, communist or otherwise, is itself part of material reality. And here he has a quote. It says, communism is not an ideal to which reality will adjust itself to. We call communism the real movement that sublates the present state of things. And that's a quote by Karl Marx. Right. So it's almost like there's an analogy to be drawn here, which is that the party is to society what the individual is to Dasein. Right? So the individual participates in Dasein and in some sense cultivates it and then benefits from it. So then the idea is that the party participates in the society and cultivates it. So it's almost like the whole, that quote by Ayn Rand where she says, reality in order to be mastered must be obeyed. Right? So to lead a society and master it means to hear it and obey it. And in some sense, like if you look at it, I feel like the best example of this that I've seen in today's world is Putin. No one would doubt that Vladimir Putin is fully in authority in Russia. He is the ultimate authority in Russia, but the way he maintains that is by bringing everyone to the table. It's very interesting. So there's one dominant party in Russia, but they still have, presidential elections. What those presidential elections end up being are like roundtables, political roundtables where he takes the time to hear, the gripes and complaints and concerns of all the other voices represented by all the other parties in the country. And then he inevitably wins, whether by hook or by crook. I'm not, he's a very popular person there. I'm sure those elections probably are legitimate because he's highly popular in Russia. But just because he wins doesn't mean that he has a mandate to just do what he wants. He takes all of these concerns into consideration and tries to find the golden path. So I guess in that sense, Putin is probably the ultimate Marxist-Leninist in practice. Something to think about. That is enough for today. I need to get a cup of coffee and then get back to work.